Благодаря, Норберт. Сега искам да предоставя думата на професор Джей Ди Мадокс, който е водещ експерт в областта на националната сигурност с изключително голям международен опит. Работил е в Държавния департамент, където е координирал дейността във връзка с противодействието на терористичната пропаганда, а сега е професор в университета Джордж Мейсън в Вашингтон. Джей Ди.
Доброе утро, guten Morgen, good morning. I'm going to use English. Thank you very much for having me here today. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with all of you. A special thank you to the Center for the Study of Democracy for inviting me here. This morning I'd like to take just 10 minutes to speak with you about the conditions and intentions of Russia's use of hybrid tactics related to weapons of mass destruction. And from the top, I'd like to acknowledge that this room almost certainly includes a vast array of viewpoints on this issue and on Russia itself. But I want to encourage honest dialogue, and we can only solve these problems if we are using honest dialogue. So I hope you'll bear with me. That's a bit small, unfortunately. This slide, if you're able to read it, goes through categories of Russia's use of WMD-related themes throughout its hybrid warfare activities, intentionally its influence activities. And it's broken into 4 different categories: false flag claims, biolabs disinformation, poisonings, and its most recent nuclear power plant takeover. And it intentionally breaks down these activities by the activity itself, of course, but also the messaging effects of each of these operations and the intentions behind those messaging effects. And the point of this is to describe a very intentional program by the Kremlin to assert these disinformation narratives and other influence operations against the West and against its own people. The basic findings behind these operations are that Russia has and continues to undertake varied operations with varied intentions, including to warn its own dissidents against rebellious activities, to signal its willingness to contravene international norms, to detract from the West's diplomatic activities and controls, to assert confusion on the battlefield, and to justify its offensive military actions. And when we encounter these activities singly, it can sometimes be difficult to understand why they're important and how they fit into the broader structure of Russia's disinformation operations or hybrid warfare activities. So a little more detail about those 4 categories. The false flag claims that we have experienced in the last few years, just recently, extend from the war in Syria through the current further invasion of Ukraine. In Syria, we saw the Russians actively push false flag claims of chemical attacks by the West, and those false flag claims would then be followed up by actual chemical attacks by Syrian forces. That same methodology seems to have been used in Ukraine recently. A good example is when the Kremlin declared that there was possibly a chemical explosion that had occurred near Kharkiv was actually a smokescreen for a false flag attack. So it's this repetition of a false flag narrative that has existed not just in Ukraine and Syria, but much further back. The intention behind these false flag claims, we often think in the West that these are targeted at us, and perhaps they are, but they're more intentionally targeted at the Russian people, intentionally to shore up support for the war there and to shore up support for the Kremlin's activities, and also to justify the narrative of a war that should not exist. The second category there, the biolabs disinformation efforts that we're all experiencing right now. The Kremlin has claimed that the US government has been running biolabs in Ukraine. This is a rather old and tired narrative that extends from the Cold War. They have consistently claimed that the US is involved in biowarfare activities. In fact, the activity in Ukraine has nothing to do with the development of biowarfare agents at all. This, again, is intended to undermine the US diplomatic position and to generate domestic support in Russia. They're trying to undermine how the US controls international norms. The third category of poisonings, and these, of course, have been in the news, and here in Bulgaria in 2015, there was a poisoning of an individual, and the same methodology was used multiple times over throughout Europe. These are intentionally brazen warnings to Russian detractors or dissidents and strong indicators of Russian rejections of international norms. The narrative you're supposed to take away from these attacks as a Westerner is that Russia is willing to do away with international norms and to do whatever it likes. And that is intended to strengthen the reputation of Putin in Russia itself. And then the fourth category, the most recent nuclear power plant takeover, Zaporizhia in Ukraine, is in itself an extraordinarily dangerous activity, but also a strategic activity. So very intentionally, Russia is, of course, able to control the energy output from that plant, and that's an important strategic goal. But in terms of the messaging involved, they're able to use it for power projection, but also opportunistically to blame the Ukrainian army for conducting attacks close to the site and endangering the site itself. And that, again, puts Russia in a position of justification of what they're doing on the ground. So I invite you to take a closer look at this slide when you have some time and you can actually read it. But in summary, this seemingly confusing array or combination of various WMD messaging hybrid activities places Russia in a position of power, or they believe it places them in a position of power. And to an onlooker, they may assume that Russia is above contempt. But we must remember that Russian messaging is also reactionary as we think our own messaging is. And they are as vulnerable to counter-messaging as anybody else is. And so a postscript to this discussion is that some of the most effective solutions to Russia's narratives, false narratives, is the development of a core, strong, unifying message of resolve among Western nations. By demonstrating that unity and resolve, we are more resilient to the Russian hybrid warfare and disinformation messaging, and we are displaying to the rest of the world that we're committed to a worldview, a democratic, liberal worldview. And we have to be consistent and strong with that messaging throughout all of our communications and push that deliberately. And we need to forestall Russia's spoiler tactics. That means getting ahead of those false flag claims, getting ahead of the biolabs disinformation. And we can do that through many of the strategies and tactics that are described in the new CSD report, and I hope you'll take a look at that. So thank you very much for hearing me out, and I hope we get a chance to talk about some of these points later. Thank you.